It was all going so well until one stupid mistake nearly ruined this project. Trust me, that's the last thing you want to be thinking in the middle of a woodworking project as you stare at that one-of-a-kind piece of wood you found that inspired you to make something in the first place. After all, you really only get one shot at it, unless you get lucky. But let's start at the beginning and see if you can figure out where I screwed up. At the start of every project, you always need to source out the material you're going to be working with. Sometimes it's as simple as going to the lumber yard, and sometimes you gotta do a little searching for those hidden gems, which is where I started with this. A friend of mine had some leftover chunks of wood from trees he cut down that had been drying for quite some time. So we struck up a deal, and after a 600k round trip, I got myself some unique wood to make some projects with. So after loading up all the wood, I was really amped up to work with the cookies that he had given me. They were pretty unique shaped and thought they could be turned into something quite neat. So of course the first step was to flatten them out on the CNC machine. Luckily for me, I have that available to me to work with. And a lot of you might not have that capability, but don't let it stop you. You can always make your own router sled to do this. As you do the one side to make it parallel, you gotta flip it over and do the other side. Of course, one problem with working with cookies and slabs like this is that that this had been chainsawed by hand, so it wasn't even, so I had to straighten it out on the CNC machine. And two, with cookies, you're working with end grain, and as most of you probably know, end grain is fairly hard and burns fairly easily. It's just that little bit more difficult to work with and get it to where you want it to be. And if you're ever milling up your own wood, always oversize your thickness. Give yourself much more than you think you need to work with, because you always find you'll have to take off quite a bit more material than you initially thought. And still ended up being nice and thick, but I did lose a fair bit of material planing it to get it nice and parallel. And after that I had to run it through the thickness sander. After several passes later through the thickness sander, finally get my first real glimpse of what this wood's going to look like. It starts to show you the true color that's going to be revealed later on as the process goes on. That's probably the thing all woodworkers find satisfying, is peeling back the layers and revealing the inner beauty of the wood you're working with. You never really know what you got until you get into it. So it's not enough just to deal with the face of the wood, you also got to deal with the edges. Luckily most of the bark had been peeled off of it by this point, so I still had to go over it and wire brush it by hand and take some chisels and get rid of all the loose crummy bits that wouldn't be good for anything. However, when sanding the edges and treating that, I like to leave some of the character with it, so I'm trying to be careful not to sand it down too much, get rid of all the loose bits that will come off later, not go down too far and get rid of the character. The problem with all these unique and funny shaped pieces of wood is there's lots of work to be done to go through the cracks and clean things up. And in this case, to get rid of the cracks, not have a big crevasse in the piece and have a catch-all, for the best way I figured to do this was fill up the cracks and crevices with some black epoxy. The crummy part about epoxy, as some of you may know already, is it's pretty costly material to work with. And with this cookie, I wasn't going to form out the whole thing and try and pour it up. I really wanted to keep the live edge, so I just needed to pour some epoxy in the cracks in areas that needed to fill in. Kind of had to dam things up with some caulking and tape and fill it so I wasn't having it leak through the whole piece and just waste the epoxy. The real trick is trying to get it all sealed up properly so it wasn't leaking epoxy everywhere. That's expensive and it's quite messy and pointless to be doing that. A big waste of time. And with clear caulking, it was a bit of a mentality of that should hold it and hope that it works. And it more or less did. To fill the voids, I ended up using a thicker epoxy. I wasn't about to use the deep pore epoxy as it's quite thin and finds its way into all the pores and whatnot. I kind of wanted this to set up fairly quick and I didn't need it to go all the way through the piece. So I just used Equal Epoxy's UV epoxy and tinted it black. The UV epoxy is a little more viscous material than the deep pour like flow cast, and it sets up quite a bit quicker too. It's about an 8-hour setup time, so hoping that I can work with it the next day. However, I did make a small mistake while doing this, as some of you may have guessed already by watching, but if not, you'll soon see shortly. Well, the epoxy was setting up and couldn't work on the cookie, so I moved on to the legs next. So every good table needs a nice set of legs to complement the table. So I could buy the legs online, that would be feasible enough. The shape of this made it a little challenging to just buy some legs, and I thought I could do a better job of making something on my own. And in keeping the legs simple and not overcomplicating it, I opted to just use some fur and do a lap joint rather than do some fancy type of joinery. Although, rather than spend a whole bunch of time setting up router and special jigs for it, I just did my lap joints in the miter saw. Worked out pretty good. In making my own, I could kind of come up with a way to complement the shape of the cookie. So in this case, I opted to do kind of a cross shape design and keep it a little more modern as well.
Oh my god, Dad, you may not see it. You ripped though?
Oh, thank you, bud.
I good.
You're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we'll get out of here tonight yet.
What?
And maybe we'll get out of here tonight yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Daddy, Daddy, Daddy.
Holy, holy, holy.
Daddy.
What's that?
Oh, we're done.
And throughout the video, as you've probably seen, I had my little helper in the building with me. At least he was in the helping mood and not a total destroyer mood. I opted to join my vertical and horizontal pieces just with a simple miter. And basically I just pre-glued it, pre-drilled it, and threw a screw in it. And trust me, that's not going anywhere. At this point, I wasn't totally sure what my plans were for finishing the legs, but I really wanted to try some Sugi Ban and burn the wood and try to do something a little different with it. It adds a subtle but interesting texture to the wood. Although burning wood sounds like fun and it is fun at first, it does get a little monotonous with a small little torch. Kind of feels like watching paint dry, really. Basically, I torch the wood till it's blackened on all sides and in all the nooks and crannies. But worse than watching paint dry and burning wood is taking that burnt wood and wire brushing all the burnt stuff off. It's quite messy and it gets everywhere. Of course, this is made easier with a drill and a wire brush attachment, but not super fun. Though as cool as it all looked brushing it all off, still wasn't quite satisfied with the color combination I was left with. I really like the simple black look after charring it. However, I didn't want to just leave it burnt, as the burnt stuff is fairly brittle and flaky and likes to peel off and get everywhere, especially on a piece of furniture that could be by some white couches or rugs or something. So I opted to do some staining. Decided to use a little black stain on it and just a simple oil-based wipe on, wipe off sort of thing. And just used a rag to brush it on and then wipe it off and work it in all the grooves and nooks and crannies. And if you need to see a video about staining, I do have one of those on my channel you can check out. However, it's a pretty simple process of just putting the stain on and then wiping it all off and letting it dry before moving on to the clear coats. And of course, to seal the stain in, I just opted to use a satin lacquer finish on it. Of course, I just spray it once, let that dry, sand it with 320 grit sandpaper, being careful not to sand through the sealer coat down through the stain and into the bare wood. And if you do that, you can always just touch it up with a little paintbrush. And then once you get the sealer coat sanded, just hit it again with the same lacquer and seal it up with that. And of course, I have a spray booth and a pressure pot and spray gun, but if you don't have that, you can get by with just a spray bomb or doing the brush on finish as well. Black Epoxy had time to set up, so instead of spending a bunch of time sanding it off with a belt sander or a random orbital, I put it through the thickness sander again, and it made short work of getting the epoxy sanded down flush to the wood. It was at this point I was starting to realize I have a problem. A potentially huge, ugly problem. One simple mistake nearly turned this cool, unique, one-of-a-kind piece of wood into a good candidate for the trash bin. As I was running it through the sander, I started to notice that the black epoxy I had poured earlier to fill in any gaps and cracks got all sucked up into the end grain. In fact, you could see all the little puddles and drips I had made while pouring the epoxy. And at this point, I was starting to freak out and get that sinking feeling that this may not be fixable. And it really looked like crap. But at this point, The only way out was to go further in, so I just kept running it through the thickness sander, trying to throw a Hail Mary, hoping for the best. And after losing some more thickness than I would have liked, I got lucky. The unfortunate part is, after running it through the thickness sander, I still need to do some final sanding on this slab. Sanding is bad enough already. Of course, the worst part of sanding this is it's on end grain, so it just takes that little bit of extra time and elbow grease to get rid of all the sanding and milling marks left behind by the thickness sander and whatever else before it. Fortunately for me, I only needed to sand up to 180 grit, so I started at 100 and worked my way up from there to 180. And had it been a different type of finish, I might have had to sand this further, which would have taken much longer. In my case, what I did was seal it once, sand it with 320 grit sandpaper. In between steps, I did notice some little bubbles I had missed from the epoxy and whatnot, so all you got to do is take a little burn-in stick to match the color of the area you're trying to fill in, and just rub that in, rub it off, use a little sandpaper, and that does a wonderful job of getting rid of those little pinholes without having to go through a whole process of pouring more epoxy or some other means. Once that was done and the sanding was done on it, again, I just hit it up with another top clear coat. And I really like using lacquer for this. The lacquer does a really good job of bringing out the different colors in the wood and contrasts, and really makes this piece pop. Whereas if I had used a water base in this case, it would not have been nearly as visually interesting or pleasing in my mind. In the end, even with my little mishap, I was really happy with how both the table and the leg turned out. Now, what I didn't mention at any point earlier was that I was planning to put this table up for sale at a local craft show with some products my wife was planning on selling. And you know you have a good piece on your hand when virtually everybody that passed by the booth slowed down and turned to gaze on it. And I literally had hundreds of comments on how beautiful the wood looked and what a nice piece it was and how it felt, actually. And with all the positive feedback, you'd have thought that this would have sold a lot quicker than it did, but on the second last day of the second trade show, it finally sold. And let's play a game in the comments. Guess what the final price this piece sold for was. And if you at all like this video or like this type of content, do me a solid and hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean a lot. Thanks for watching.